everyone. May I request you?
Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today from different time zones from across the world, some even in the middle of the night. So today's webinar, Fueling Change, Transformative Role of DFIs in Funding Energy Transition in Developing Asia, organized under the aegis of Climate Week New York, is a joint initiative by the Association of DFIs in Malaysia, CSG, Association of DFIs in Asia Pacific, the Initiative on Closing the Investment Gap, and the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. With keynote addresses and an expert panel discussion, the webinar aims to explore innovative financing mechanisms for DFIs to play a catalytic role in energy transition. Through interesting conversations, the session would focus on identifying challenges and solutions to scale financing, addressing policy and regulatory barriers, and exploring options for DFIs to play a larger role in scaling climate finance in developing Asia. Let's start by a quick introduction of the organizations of today's webinar. So Adfim is a focal point of 90 development banks and other financial institutions in 40 countries and territories in the Asia Pacific region and aims to scale sustainable development through its members. CSG is a global expert advisory firm in climate finance, ESG, climate risks, and sustainable finance, and aims at accelerating global sustainable finance and climate transition. The organization stands at the intersection of finance, investments, and sustainability, and has been awarded marquee projects by international governments, multilaterals, and financial institutions. Adfim is a unique combination of development financial institutions and entrepreneur development organizations. With a membership base of about 17 institutions, Adfim aims to promote synergy and collaboration in the development finance and banking industry in Malaysia. Closing the Investment Gap Initiative, the CIG initiative, builds the financial sector capacities of developing countries and supports efforts to attract large-scale financing for key sustainable infrastructure projects. And IFA is a non-profit think tank that produces independent public interest research and analysis on energy markets, climate trends, and policies. The Institute specializes in analyzing the role of climate finance in bridging the green transition gap. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our esteemed speakers joining us today. With us today, we have Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General, International Solar Alliance. He had earlier headed the Indian Bureau of Energy Efficiency and was responsible for its foundational programs, which mainstreamed energy efficiency in the country. He was also the Indian spokesperson at the Paris climate negotiations and was appointed a Chevalier d'Ordre National du Mérite by the President of France in recognition of his outstanding commitment to preservation of environment. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Mathur. Next, we have Tim Gold, Chief Energy Economist, International Energy Agency. As Chief Energy Economist, he provides strategic advice on energy economics across a wide range of IEA activities and analysis. And before joining IEA, Mr. Gold had worked on European and Eurasian energy issues in Brussels. We welcome you, Tim. I would like to welcome Ms. Namita Vikas, founder and managing director of Octus ESG. Namita is an award-winning senior business leader with over 3 decades of diverse global experience in sustainable finance, ESG, and climate strategy across banking and technology. And earlier, she held a CXO position with a large Indian private bank and issued several first-of-its-kind sustainable finance products and raised over $1 billion of green capital from global DFIs. Next, we have Dr. Irving Minso, Director of the Initiative on Closing the Investment Gap in Sustainable Infrastructure, and also the Senior Research Scholar at the University of Maryland. Dr. Minso has been involved in the international negotiations related to global climate change for over 30 years now. Welcome, Irv. Mr. Enrique Florencio, the Secretary General of Adfim, has been an active technical member of sustainability strategic consulting for over a decade and has also worked in CSR Asia and some of the CSR projects in Philippines. Mohammad Prasad Hanif, Secretary General of Adfim, is an author, keynote speaker, trainer, and coach, and specializes in leadership and business transformation in Malaysia. Among the panelists, we have Mr. Anand Vishwanathan, EVP and Head, Market and Liquidity Risk and ERM and Model Risk, Axis Bank, who is responsible for market risks as well as liquidity risks of the bank. As the second panelist, Mr. Hussein Mullah, Head of Mind and Sustainability, Bank Pembangunan Malaysia Berhad. He has over 27 years of experience in finance, risk management, climate, and sustainability. We also have Mr. Ritesh Thakkar, Senior Advisor, Asia Pacific Convergence Blended Finance Singapore, who's an expert in financial services, development finance, management consulting, and works extensively in SDGs and green finance policy development. Our esteemed panelist, Ms. Vibhuti Garg, Director, South Asia IFA, focuses on promoting sustainable development through influencing policy interventions on energy pricing, adoption of new technologies, subsidy reforms, and enhancing clean energy access. Our next panelist, Mr. Ahmed Badr, Director, Project Facilitation and Support, International Renewable Energy Agency, brings more than 30 years of international experience in the field of banking and finance. And we also have Mr. Sebastian Bro, Managing Director of ME Soulshare Limited, where he founded the startup in 2014 and aims to provide vulnerable communities access to energy services. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. A few quick announcements before we start. We have an exciting lineup of speakers, as you just heard. So I would request each speaker to observe the prescribed speaking time. And for participants, please key in your questions in the Q&A box on the screen, and we will take it up. In addition to Zoom, this event is also being live streamed on Adfim's LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook pages. Let me quickly go over the plan for today's session. We will begin with an address from our partners, Mr. Hanif and Mr. Enrique's address. Following this, Ms. Namita Vikas will set the tone and context for today's discussion. This will be followed by special address by Dr. Minso. Mr. Ajay Mathur and Mr. Tim Gould will deliver our keynote addresses for the day. And this will finally be followed up by a dynamic panel discussion and also a Q&A session at the end. With this, may I request now to play the key messages from our partners, Adfim and Adfiap, Mr. Prasad and Enrique. Mr. Prasad was there earlier, but Enrique had to be away on an emergency, so we have their videos. Can we have their messages, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, good day to all of you, and welcome to this pivotal webinar on a subject that is not just timely, but also urgent: how development finance institutions can act as transformative catalysts in the global energy transition. I am Mohammad Prasad Hanif, Secretary General of the Association of Development Finance Institutions of Malaysia, or Adfim. It is an honor to be here with you today. First and foremost, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Ms. Namita Vikas, founder and managing partner of Octus ESG, and Mr. Enrique Florencio, Secretary General of the Association of Development Finance Institutions in the Asia Pacific, or ADFIA. Your leadership and commitment to sustainable development and climate action are both inspiring and instrumental. Thank you for bringing us all together for this critical dialogue. We are at a crossroads. The energy transition is no longer an option, but a necessity. With financial commitments reaching a record US 1.3 trillion in 2022, we have made some progress. However, the scale of the challenge ahead is monumental. To meet the Paris Agreement's ambitious but essential goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, investments need to surge to over US 4.4 trillion annually until 2050. In Asian developing countries, the stakes are even higher. Many households still lack access to energy, and the energy they do have access to needs to be clean from the get-go. This is not just an infrastructural challenge, but a moral imperative. As DFIs, we have a unique role to play. Currently, we fund only about 3% of global clean energy investments. While this is a start, we must aim higher. We must be the pioneers in sectors that commercial finance has yet to venture into. We must focus on innovative structures and credit enhancement over traditional loans to mitigate investment risks and ensure impactful returns. In short, our role is not just to provide standard financing, but to drive the global energy transition. Today's session aims to strategize exactly how we can do that. We will delve into themes such as identifying energy transition projects, innovative risk-reducing mechanisms, blended finance structures, and much more. This is not just another webinar, this is a call to action. So let us use this platform to collaborate, innovate, and most importantly, act. Let us remember that we are not just simple financial institutions. We are institutions of change, and the time for that change is now. Thank you very much, and I look forward to a stimulating and productive discussion. Have fun, network, and learn. Thank you very much. My name is Mohammad Prasad Hanif. Do reach out to us if you wish to collaborate. Thank you.
That was a very relevant messages from Hanif. Can we play Enrique's video, please?
A pleasant good morning, good afternoon to everyone. On behalf of the Association of DFIs in Asia and the Pacific, or ADFIA, I wish to welcome you all today to today's event. ADFIA is a focal point of 91 member DFIs in Asia and the Pacific and has been at the forefront of promoting sustainable development. I am both pleased and honored to speak to you today and share our contribution in our little way. This event marks a crucial milestone in our collective efforts to drive sustainable development and address the pressing challenges of energy transition in developing regions of Asia. As the world grapples with the need to reduce carbon emissions and shift towards renewable energy sources, the role of development finance institutions become increasingly pivotal. DFIs have a transformative power to catalyze change by providing financial resources, technical expertise, and strategic guidance to enable the transition towards a low-carbon economy. DFIs play a crucial role in shaping the future of energy in Asia, driving innovation and creating sustainable pathways for economic growth. Here's how ADFIA member DFIs contribute to funding the energy transition. First, ADFIA member DFIs provide funding for renewable energy projects such as solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal power plants. Second, Adfim member DFIs finance projects that enhance energy efficiency in industries, buildings, and infrastructure. Third, Adfim member finance projects that promote access to clean energy, particularly in rural and remote areas, supporting off-grid and mini-grid solutions. Fourth, Adfim member DFIs support technology innovation by providing funding for research and development, pilot projects, and commercialization of new technologies that contribute to the energy transition. Fifth, Adfim member DFIs offer capacity building programs and technical assistance to project developers, governments, and other stakeholders involved in the energy transition. And last, DFIs act as a catalyst for private sector investments in the energy transition. They leverage their funds to attract additional investments from commercial banks, institutional investors, and impact investors. As we embark on this journey together, let us keep in mind the urgency of our mission. The need for sustainable energy solution is ever increasing, and the time to act is now. By aligning our efforts, we can make a significant impact and create a brighter, cleaner, and more prosperous future for the people of Asia. Once again, we extend a warm welcome to all participants. Let us seize this opportunity to fuel change, drive innovation, and pave the way for a transformative energy transition in developing Asia. Thank you, and let us begin this inspiring journey together.
Thank you, Enrique, for that message and for your 6 areas of identified areas of work by your member DFIs. I would now like to invite Namita to set the context for today's session. Over to you, Namita.
Thank you very much, Smita, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined this panel. A very special welcome to all the speakers and the panelists. Thank you, Dr. Erwin Mitza. I know it's 2:47 a.m. in New York, and thanks a lot for joining in from a very different time zone. Dr. Ajay Mathur and Mr. Tim Gord, we've all been a part of this journey of energy transition over the years, and thank you so much for joining in, to share your experiences. I believe this session would serve as a knowledge base, bringing in key players in energy transition, the policymakers, the bankers, the practitioners, towards fueling finance for this kind of transition that we're looking in developing Asia. So my role is to context set, and much has been said, so I'll keep it very short. But what I want to highlight is that renewables progress has taken good shape. I mean, globally, high, a record of investments in energy transition technologies was witnessed, amounting to about $1.3 trillion. Asia is contributing nearly 60% of the worldwide increase in the renewables generating capacity. However, a yawning gap remains when it comes to financing. Renewable energy is only 14% of Asian banks' energy financing in the past 6 years, and I'm glad that we have very strong associations on board, DFIs associations, and there's so much more capital that is really required. I think while at a utility scale, projects do get capital, and we've seen examples even from India where there have been issuances, dollar denominated issuances, offshore issuances. I think renewable energy somewhere utility scale is becoming mainstream. However, financing decentralized energy, especially in the developing countries, I think that's one of the biggest question marks for investors. Given that the necessary long-term financing for such projects is often very challenging to obtain, banks in developing countries are particularly hesitant, either on account of lack of visibility of project cash flows or due to high risk of losses caused by high or uncertain inflation. And then there are other aspects that hinder capital flows that include the inability to appropriately structure finance risk mitigation mechanisms. And we know that, under the DFI reforms mechanism, there is a new role that is emerging to be able to, go beyond conventional projects that have, that deliver high renewable energy projects like these. So I think that's really something that we need to work towards. But I think the good news is that the regulatory environment is turning favorable. But at one level, there is a lot of concern. There are targets that are being taken. And this is somewhere we are seeing the eagerness to back this up with competence and actions. I think initiation of offshore wind power projects, energy storage systems, green hydrogen, ammonia, all this is really big news, good news, and this will require huge amounts of capital. Today, there are very limited or specialized financing options. Markets are immature, and creating the need for risk mitigation tools and multi-sectoral expertise is very, very critical. I think one of the areas that important to point out is that accurately estimating the investment potential of green hydrogen, for example, as an alternative fuel, I think those are areas that are becoming super important for the ecosystem to look at. And investments would need to double down, significantly increase on multiple aspects. I mean, we need to think about not just the alternative fuel, but the peripheral infra storage that's linked to that. And I think it is very necessary also to look at the operational capacity, infrastructure at scale, technology development. I think all this go hand in hand. On the policy front, I think there is a step change that is seen to India's G20 presidency has resulted in a huge internal boost. It has placed ample emphasis on promoting solar utilization, and I'm so glad that Ajay is here today. The International Solar Alliance has been really appointed to drive finance, and that's I think the big thing that's come out of the G20. I think in view of all these developments, it's very timely and opportune for all of us to come together under this Climate Week New York 2023 platform, and one, focus on transition finance, to look at how to equip DFIs in emerging markets towards net zero, and their overall role that is becoming so critical in catalyzing private capital. So with that, I will hand it over back to Smita, and we're looking forward to a very exciting session ahead of us. Thank you very much. Over to you, Smita.
Thank you very much, Namita, for setting the context. It was extremely interesting and insightful. Moving on, I would like to invite Dr. Irving Mincer to share his insights on global perspectives on energy transition. Over to you, Irv.
Thank you, Smita. And thank you especially to Adfim and to Adfim, and most importantly to Octus ESG, for bringing together this distinguished group and focusing international attention on the role of DFIs in both transforming the financial sector and addressing the climate crisis. The climate crisis is already upon us. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in July, climate change is here, it's terrifying, and this is just the beginning. The era of global warming has ended, and the era of global boiling has arrived. We need to address this crisis, to turn down the heat, and instead mobilize the power of the market to close the extraordinary gap that was emphasized by Dr. Hanif and by Namita in the difference between what we are currently investing in addressing this crisis and what it will take to fill it. The gap is only measured in trillions. 3 trillion or more is what is needed to address this challenge. The IPCC in AR6 has indicated that we have less than 10 years from today as we speak to avoid irreversible step changes in the functioning of the global climate system to avoid the worst impacts that will deliver horrible blows to people on all contexts. The DFIs that are represented here and others are key to that transformation, because there will never be enough money in the public treasuries of rich or poor countries to fill that gap and make the investments that are needed to provide the services that will drive economic growth in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. The only place where that money is available in sufficient scale to meet the speed and scale with which the risk of climate change is growing is in the private sector, and especially under the management of institutional investors. Engaging these investors in the transition to a clean energy economy is critical. And the only way that we will be able to do that is by providing secure, low-risk opportunities that drive capital on the ground in developing countries into the transformative actions that are needed to meet this crisis head-on. DFIs have a crucial role to play in many of those actions, including all 6 of the steps that were outlined by Dr. Florencio. But most importantly, DFIs are the pioneers in transforming the financial sector by providing risk mitigation mechanisms and guarantees that will allow institutional investors and others in the private sector to deploy their capital in developing countries in ways that will maintain control in host communities and drive the change that's needed to turn down the heat on global warming and accelerate the pace of fair, equitable, and sustainable economic development. The DFIs that are part of ADFIAP and Adfim are especially important, as Asia will be both an engine of economic growth and a locus of extraordinary vulnerability to the impacts of climate change unless we meet the challenges that are described in this webinar. So I leave it to those of you who know the Asian Pacific situation best to point the way, both for those in Asia and others, toward making the investments in sustainable infrastructure, in clean energy, and in public services that will drive that economic growth, leading us together away from the dangers of the climate crisis and toward a real, secure, and sustainable economic future. Thank you, and I wish you the best from Climate Week in New York City.
Thank you all for those interesting insights and perspectives, and for putting it out so clearly on how critical DFIs play a role in this entire energy transition journey. I'm now very pleased to invite Dr. Mathur for his keynote address. We will hear from Dr. Mathur on how finance can be enhanced to enable the decentralized renewable energy solutions market across EMDs, and how under its Towards 1,000 strategy, ISA plans to mobilize and deploy $1 trillion for solar solutions by 2030. Over to you, Dr. Mathur.
Thank you very much, Smita. Many thanks to you, Namita, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have old friends of many years, not old friends, but friends of many years like Irv being here. I note that Tim is here as well. So, and to meet new friends. Smita and Namita made the focus of this on how DFIs can enhance the role of DFIs in financing clean energy. And as I look at that, the first thing that strikes my mind is that we are seeing a major increase in the overall financing that is occurring for clean energy. This year, it's expected to cross $1.7 trillion globally. $1.7 trillion. But most of it is going into the OECD countries and China and possibly India. this accounts for something like 1 trillion of the 1.7 trillion. This implies that the first challenge that we have is to make clean energy finance flow into parts of the world where it is not flowing, so that we can have solarization, we can have clean energy in the countries where it is not happening, the developing countries in particular. The second point that I see is that approximately 2/3 of the finance that is happening is largely occurring in large solar farms. So what is happening in small solar, the rooftop solar, the solar pumps, the solar cold storages, solar that provides use to people, enhances their incomes, and therefore becomes part of their daily lives, is relatively limited. At the most, it is 2/3. This is the second area that we need to focus on. There are two other areas which I will focus on, but I will not stress them very much. One of them is the concentration of manufacturing. 2 countries in the world account for 80% of the solar modules that are produced. This leads to supply chain constraints, and choking of supply chains have led to solar modules costing about 20% more than they did in 2020. This is a problem. We have seen a long-term decline in the price of solar modules, but this upturn is a matter of concern. Consequently, especially as we look to the future, we look to the solar demand increasing by at the minimum 3 times, but it could be as high as 8 times what it is now in 2030. So that's only 7 years. We are seeing a 3 to 8 times increase in solar demand. We need to diversify the manufacturing chain. And the last inequity that I'd like to say is that there has been a lot of effort on, as I said, solar farms, and wind farms, which are producing electricity when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. But what happens when it is not? There has been relatively little investment from DFIs, but even less from the commercial sector on how to enable electricity to be provided to people when the sun is not shining, when the wind is not blowing. Investment in storage, investment in hydro, investment in nuclear has been relatively limited. But as I said, these last 2 inequities I will not focus on. So let me also say what our understanding is as far as the DFI structure is concerned from the point of view of what has been most successful. The ISA works with about 55 developing countries on an active daily basis. When we see DFI investments, we clearly see a pattern. And the pattern is that in order to build the markets, in order to whet appetite, to whet demand, there have to be available technological products which people, you and I, need. This means that we need these to be available at prices that you and I can afford. Consequently, the first issue is providing highly subsidized capital to build up the demand more than anything else. The next step that we see happening is that as the demand grows, the monies become available as concessional finance. This is where DFIs play a major role. They are able to provide finance at prices which are less than those of commercial capital, but that creates the infrastructure for developers to come in to start developing projects, to start developing products and the supply chains to provide them to the market. And the third step is to move from concessional finance to blended finance. So there is still a degree of concessionality, as far as commercial capital is concerned, the DFIs still are making the kind of returns that the DFIs are comfortable with. Commercial capital needs more. But when you combine the two, you are able to have a lower price of capital than others. And the last on which I want to speak a little bit is guarantees. If you want to get commercial capital in, and I use the words which were used by Irv a minute ago, if we want to engage the institutional investors, we need to make it comfortable for them to invest in countries and in sectors where they are not investing, where they feel uncomfortable in going. Guarantees help them. And let me give you an example. As the International Solar Alliance, we have recently created a global solar facility. And the global solar facility has three parts, but the most important one of which is a guarantee facility. Anybody who invests in Africa, that's the first global solar facility we have set up. Anybody who invests in small solar in Africa, so not solar farms, but almost anything else, can buy a guarantee. And what does that guarantee do? That if there is a delay in payment, and we did our homework before this, we talked to a lot of institutional investors, we talked to DFIs, we talked to people who had lent for solar in Africa, and we found that the non-repayment rate was less than 2%, which means that the perceived risk is far higher. The premium on capital is almost 6%, even though the non-repayment rate is 2%. That the perception of risk is far higher than the actual risk. So people do get paid, but what happens typically is they get paid later than what the promise is. So what we said was that this guarantee would provide an interest-free loan for the duration till the investor gets his money. Note that we are paying the investor, not the developer. Otherwise, there is a conflict of interest. There's a moral hazard more than a conflict of interest. And as and when the investor gets the money, they repay the guarantee fund. This provides confidence to the investors to invest both in projects in small areas and in Africa, places where investments are not, institutional investments are not occurring. The two other funds which are part of the Global Solar Facility look at providing interest-free loans for premium on insurance. Because in many countries, once you add the insurance costs, and this is insurance related to not just the technical equipment, because you can typically get a back-to-back guarantee from the supplier of the equipment, but it is much more about expropriation by countries, it's about foreign currency risk and so on. These often are so large, the premiums are so large that they make the project unviable. So we provide interest-free loans which are paid back once the main loan has been paid. So again, this comes back into the fund, but it comes back when the investor is ready to pay back, is in a position to pay back. And it helps the project bide over the initial hump of paying back the capital and paying the premium on the interest. So we are not providing the insurance, but we are providing the premium which the interest needs. And the third is that we want to work with you, the DFIs, so that there is a stash of seed capital that is available at the interest rates at which you are willing to lend. When we combine this with the commercial capital, this creates a lower cost capital, the blended capital that we spoke about, which makes it a lot more convenient, both for the commercial investor to invest in and for the project developer to borrow on the other hand. These three things together, therefore, create an ecosystem which makes it viable for the institutional investors to come in. We believe that the DFIs need to create these guarantees. We also are completely aware that that DFIs need to ensure that the capital that they lend is at the lowest rates possible, because that is their mandate, to make capital available to developing countries at the lowest interest rates. But if they start lending for risky projects which they may not get returns, then they will have a problem, because then their interest rates will go up. So we fully recognize that the DFIs need to protect their capital. And consequently, the amount of capital that is made available has to be limited, particularly in new areas of investment, new technologies of investment. My own belief is that guarantees fulfill that purpose. In an earlier avatar, when I was with the Bureau of Energy Efficiency and worked very, very closely with Namita at that time, we had created a guarantee fund. And that guarantee fund led to a leveraging of by a factor of about 20. So if you assume leveraging of anywhere between 12 and 15 times, you can see that the amount of resources that are put in as guarantees lead in turn to a huge amount of institutional investment coming in. I would like, therefore, to end this intervention by asking the DFIs to seriously consider how do you most proactively use your money to guarantee the flow of commercial capital into the small clean energy sector, because that is an area, and particularly in developing countries, because that is an area where money is not flowing in right now. And at the risk of tom-tomming ISA, I would strongly urge the DFIs to put in some resources into the Global Solar Facility to help us move forward as well. This could be a very strong learning on the basis of which a larger scale facility could be developed by each of the DFIs to help money flow into sectors, into regions where it is not flowing today. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mathur. Very insightful, and particularly liked the way you kind of broke it down on where financing is going currently, what are the gaps, and what are the innovative solutions which ISAs adopted to kind of address these gaps. So thank you very much. I would now like to invite Mr. Tim Gold to deliver his keynote address. Tim, eager to hear from you on changing policies, regulations, its implications, especially for DFIs, in the context of scaling energy transition in EMDs and the influential role played by IEA. Over to you, Tim.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the chance to join you today. Thanks very much, Namita, for the invitation. It's great to join colleagues, people who we very much admire here at the IEA, and I'm going to echo many of the points just made by AJ Mathur. But I would like to, as always with the IEA, we like to quantify things. So with a view to that, I'm just sharing some slides. And the first point is really to echo the imbalance that we are concerned about in the clean energy investment flows worldwide. So this looks like a very encouraging picture, but when you take out the increase in advanced economies, when you take out the increase in China, there are certainly bright spots elsewhere, and India is undoubtedly one of them. But in aggregate there, we do have, that is the problem that we're trying to solve. That's where there's still a lot to be done. And that's where we believe that the international community needs to provide additional support, and the role of DFIs is, of course, crucial here for all the reasons that we've heard. We also heard from Irvin how that need for a scale up is huge, and I wanted to illustrate that here. This is clean energy investment in emerging developing countries. We're excluding China, and this is what would need to happen if we are to get on track for a 1.5 degree stabilization in global average temperatures. That's a 7-fold increase in the volumes of clean energy investments over a 10-year period. And you can see that that's not just about renewable power or low emission power. you need the infrastructure, you need to focus also on end use sectors, and we need also attention to the molecules, to the low emissions fuels that are going to be part of our cleaner energy future. And countries in developing Asia, that's 40% of that total, and that just underlines the reason why the discussions today are so important. So the question that we're all grappling with is, where could that money come from? This is our estimation of the sources of primary finance for the clean energy investment today. You can see in the emerging developing economies, you can see the strong role of public sources of finance there, much stronger than is the case in advanced economies. But when we conceptualize, when we think through what would need to change in order to generate that scale up in clean energy investment, you do need, in our view, to see a doubling from public sources, including from state-owned enterprises. The DFIs really have a crucial role to play to scale up, in particular, those sources of private finance. And when we think through the mechanisms through which that could happen, we did some work which we presented to the summit here in Paris on a new global financing pact. We did some joint analysis with the International Finance Corporation. And I want to just leave you with 4 interrelated areas that we think are crucial for the scaling up of private finance. And this applies in developing Asia, but it also applies elsewhere too. People have talked about the need for policy reform, strengthened institutional capacity. That, of course, the policy prescriptions vary depending on which part of the energy system you're talking about. But I would emphasize the need for a strong overarching vision of where clean energy fits into national strategies, how it meets national development goals, because without that, you lack a bit of visibility for investors and for DFIs on the direction of travel. Let's make sure that we also have a broad understanding of the suite of technologies that are needed. We're not just talking about renewable power. We need to have much more attention to infrastructure, to grids. You have a situation at the moment where a new renewable project can be put in place in 2 years, but a new transmission line takes at least double that. So network planning needs to be ahead of the curve, and in most countries that is simply not the case. And let's also have in mind that it's not just about building up the clean. We also need in many countries to have strategies for scaling back the contribution of more carbon intensive sources as well. And that means managing the social implications of change, but also helping to ease the exit of the most polluting sources of generation in some cases. So integrated approaches, obviously very, very important. We do need significantly more concessional finance, and that is a message that we've passed to the debate on the role of the multilateral development banks. We estimate that, together with IFC, we estimate that some $80 to $100 billion per year in concessional finance will be needed by the end of this decade to get us on track for sustainable development and climate goals. And this support needs to be concentrated in areas where you have higher levels of country risk or newer technologies, like battery storage, low emission hydrogen, or where investors need to contend with macroeconomic risks, for example, around exchange rates. And I think AJ was making some very important observations on leverage. Let's just have in mind that if you look at the OECD numbers for climate finance, there was about $30 billion in public climate finance that went to energy and energy-related areas like transport and industry in 2020. That $30 billion mobilized just $10 billion in private finance. So a leverage ratio, $1 of public money generated around 30 cents of additional private money. We need to turn that around. We need to have a situation where every dollar of public money is working much harder to bring in private money. So leverage ratios where we get up to sort of $6 or $7 of private money for each public. So that means a much more of a focus on project de-risking and mobilization. The role of guarantees, as AJ mentioned, is absolutely critical. Less perhaps on direct financing of projects, so to maximize that potential to leverage private investors. And we would like to see that DFIs don't crowd out private investors in markets where clean energy technologies are already mature and commercial finance may be available. Another point, we need some new financing instruments and platforms such as green sustainability-linked loans, project aggregation platforms, and carbon markets. We need to make that link between the sort of $2.5 trillion of ESG-related investment funds worldwide. Today, hardly any of that capital is flowing to emerging and developing markets. And the role of institutional investors has been mentioned. I think we need to think creatively about the project aggregation platforms and securitization vehicles that can attract some of those funding to to allow us to overcome the barrier of the small investable size of many of the smaller the projects that are needed. And a final point is about the importance of deeper local capital markets and financial systems to allow us for domestic savings to increase and to be channeled into productive private investment. And very important here as an important source of local currency financing, and that can help improve affordability, particularly given the high cost of currency hedging that's needed to attract international capital. And we see some good examples of that in developing Asia, in China and India, in Thailand, lots of domestic finance there for energy transitions. And we need to take those lessons and apply them more broadly across the region. So those are some thoughts from the International Energy Agency. Many thanks once again for the invitation, and I look forward very much to hearing the discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very insightful and very useful how you broke down the needs, quantifying them and put out the 4 action points. So thank you very much. It was so now the initial remarks are done. We will jump into our dynamic panel discussion. Before that, may I request if we could click a picture. So can I request if everybody can turn on their cameras? Thank you very much. Let me hand it over to you, Namita, now. May I please request you to moderate our discussion for the day? Over to you.
Thank you very much. And these were some very solid recommendations from Tim, from Ajay. I think there's so much potential for DFIs to come together, and I'm glad that we have a few of them on the panel. And it would be really very important to socialize this so that we know how to come together and make this all happen. So thanks. And moving on to the panel discussion, we have 2 rounds of questions that I will go with, and I would request each of the panelists to, in the interest of time and to be able to take questions, to limit their interventions to about 3 to 4 minutes. And my first question is to you, Anand, coming from Axis Bank. We've seen that estimates peg the global capital stock at over $100 trillion. And in comparison, one of the reports that IEA brought out on net zero by 2050 that indicated that the global annual energy investments averaged at around $2.3, expected to double to $5 trillion by 2030 as clean energy investments ramp up under the whole net zero commitments that are out there. So in short, what we're hearing is that there is capital that is available, and then on the other side, there are clean energy opportunities that are growing. However, when you look at bank-led funding, even in terms of when you look at green bonds, for example, I think there is a lag towards renewable energy segments other than utility, solar or wind. So, decentralized renewable makes a large space, out there. And what, in your view, are banks doing or can do to tap this growing opportunity through innovative solutions or offerings? So over to you, Anand.
Thanks. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Thanks for your question, Anita. So let me start with a different perspective. Banks have a role. They have a role of ensuring money is available where it's needed and of protecting that money. And that's where the challenge is. As long as a product is or a borrowing is viable, banks will be ready to lend. The challenge, even in the large-scale solar projects, was always about viability. When we found that NTPC or SECI could come in and provide us the right, comfort in terms of the ability to recover money, immediately solar projects became more viable. Banks actually burned their fingers a lot during the heydays of, let's say, 2016 or so. And primarily there were political issues, fuel supply issues, guarantee issues. Banks are not likely to repeat those mistakes. And what banks really need is the ability to recover that money that they are lending out, because that's the expectation of the regulator and supervisor also. Given this, it's evident therefore that a decentralized project needs support to be viable and to make sense for a bank to lend. And that's the gap. The gap is not that the banks don't want to lend, it is that the projects need to be viable and make credit sense in order to be able to qualify for lending. It does not mean that banks are doing nothing. So we are talking, as we speak, also banks like Axis have been speaking to multilateral agencies or DFIs to provide us blended finance solutions. We also keep requesting the government to review how they look at data guarantee structure and credit support in this space. Priority sector status in MSME, for example, would be a sweetener. So we expect and we require policy support, regulatory support in order to be able to put out a balance sheet for decentralized energy efficient end users, whether it is solar or wind. Because at the end of the day, we can't sacrifice credit viability when we make our decision. So that's the key thing. Banks are doing a lot, but what we need is support from the DFI world and the government world in order to ensure that deposit money is protected, which incidentally is the core objective of the RBI governor's speeches in May 23. Back to you, Namita. I hope I have answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that protection point is very, very valid, and being in the sector, I can understand very, very clearly what you've said. And I think the FIs need to really come out with innovative credit enhancements, I would think. So let me go to Hussein, who represents the largest DFI from Malaysia. So Hussein, welcome. And my question to you is that DFIs have started to look at these areas and also implementing proprietary frameworks to assist with implementation of sustainability principles, which also then include the whole viability or bankability of projects that Anand was speaking about. So BPMB's got a MIND framework, which is a good example that allows banks to enhance project valuation from credit-centric assessment to holistic end-to-end assessments, which includes reviewing ESG, ES, and economic impacts of each transaction, actually. So, in your experience, how has these kind of robust frameworks accelerated, better credit analysis, disbursement, risk mitigation, estimation, as well as mitigation towards sectors, particularly that contribute to energy transition?
Yeah, thank you, Namita. It's good to be in the same panelist session again with you. And in addressing the question, I will not really focus on to say we are particularly emphasizing on energy, but this is applicable to any kind of project that come to us that has to go through the MIND assessment. So first of all, talking about BPMB, we have been in business for 50 years. In fact, this year is our 50th anniversary. And for 50 years, we've been contributing to the national agenda. What usually we finance is whichever the government effort, that's where we want to focus on. So in doing so, for the past 50 years, we have been involved in so many kind of industry. We have been supporting from infrastructure to toll roads to railroads to energy, renewable energy, even to food manufacturing. And currently we also moving towards some circular economy. So having that variety of sectors of exposure, we need to have a proper assessment tool other than credit, because usually credit is very conventional, very typical way of financial institution assess the credit itself. So having said that, the question is how eventually we monitor the impact. So looking only from when we established MIND since 2019 to 2022, we already can see what are the impact that we can measure. For example, number of job creation, the area of underserved that we cover, how long is the road being built, and how much renewable energy that we have created in term, as comparison to the conventional energy. So we use all of this based on MIND assessment. In MIND assessment, which we developed together with World Bank, there are two main criteria to it, or there are two main area of assessment. First of all, in terms of quantitative, we need quantitative so that it can be measured. Quantitative aspect, we look from the SDG. We cover SDG 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, and 13. So if you look at from that, there are elements of climate, there are elements of energy. So that become contribution to generate a much higher score or much higher impact for our the potential cases. And then we look at from the regulator's perspective. What is the main focus from regulator? We look at whether it is SME, whether it's big corporation, whether the tenor that we are covering is not within the appetite of commercial. For example, longer period, it can be 15 years, it can be up to 20 years, where very likely commercial banks will not want to touch. And we look in terms of safeguard, how the project that we support contribute or will avoid from having negative impact on biodiversity, for example, and whether we protect the heritage area. So this is the kind of elements that we include in MIND assessment, and we look at in terms of the beneficiaries who are going to enjoy from this. For example, if it is telecommunication, whoever enjoy the network, the Wi-Fi, for example, that become beneficiaries. So that's the element that we look into. And interesting to see just now that we also will be talking about crowding in. If there are sectors where commercial bank do not have enough appetite, then this is where DFI, BPMB in this case, will be in so that they can help to crowd into that sector. So hopefully when more commercial bank come and support that kind of industry, then we can say that, okay, it's graduated, they can, commercial bank can take it, and we can start focusing on other elements. So in saying that, there are several elements that we really focusing on. For example, what are the impact in terms of job creation? What are the percentage of renewable energy contribution from that project? What's the impact to the underserved area? And what's the protection to the environment in terms of safeguards? And what are the contribution in terms of technology and innovation? And finally, in terms of whether that project can help in terms of market penetration. So I stop for now with that. I hope that answered that question, Amita.
Thank you. That is a pretty wide range. And for the interest of larger audience, MIND is measuring impact on national development. That's the full form of MIND, and that's the framework BPMB is using. Thanks a lot, Hussain. I will come back to you. Let me go over to Ritesh. Ritesh, there's much being said about blended finance, and Convergence did bring out a report on best practices for donor governments engaging blended finance that states that DFIs struggle to scale deployment capacity in low-income countries. This in turn restricts their catalytic role to draw in private sector towards energy transition. So what, in your view, can be done to judiciously use the limited DFI capital, particularly within blended finance structures, to leverage and scale capital and technical assistance from a risk standpoint? So, everybody we heard was speaking about the bankability and the viability of projects, and especially when we're talking about energy transition. Your views, please. Over to you, Ritesh.
Thank you so much, Namita, and thank you to the organizers as well for giving us an opportunity to share our perspective. Maybe before I go there, just to set the context, I just wanted to briefly introduce Convergence. We are basically a global network for blended finance, and we have over 180 plus public, private, and philanthropic organizations who are a part of Convergence as membership, who truly represent the whole stakeholders that we need to, blend two forms of capital, right? Concessional, which basically comes from donor, MDBs, DFIs, and then of course the commercial, which comes from private sector. So before I really respond to your question, Namita, I just want to set a common understanding of what is blended finance, because there are a few definitions out there, and just to make sure that we are all on the same page on this one. So in very simple and non-complicated words, right? It's nothing but how do we use concessional funding in a very catalytic way to address some of the market failures and adjust the risk return profile of investments, which can bring large scale commercial capital into advancing SDGs. And this reflects the point which Mr. Mathur was kind of highlighting, or Dr. Mathur was highlighting. And that's something which is very critical. And that's fair for us to ensure that private sector crowds in is very, very important. Otherwise, the financing gap is so huge. The concessional money is not enough to build this SDG gap that we have in a way. I also want to kind of once again remove a bit of a confusion and maybe start off with a clarification that we should not confuse blended finance with any deal which is done with a DFI. Blended finance has to have a concessional money, not just the traditional DFI money, which is the development financial institution. The DFIs, of course, receive the concessional funding from donor governments, which they often blend it with their own commercial capital, and their own commercial capital is always deployed in senior positions in hard currencies, right? So it's as commercial as it gets in the market, and then they try to mobilize the private sector, like some of the friends that we have on the panel as well. Once again, in terms of data, what we've seen is that multilateral DFIs do figure out almost in 75% of transactions, technically. So they are definitely very important to the equation, as you identified. And then now just to do a bit of a math, right? Just to demystify, what are we really talking about? So in terms of, say, for example, $100, what we've seen is that $40 is normally deployed in form of concessional funding. And out of that $40, $30 is actually coming from ODA funders, right, in concessional pot. Only $10 out of that 40 is the concessional money, which is put in by DFIs. Then adding on, the rest $35 is mobilized by DFIs at commercial rate at senior positions. Okay, so there is no concessional funding there. And then you have only $25, which really goes to third-party private sector. And this is essentially going back to the point with which Tim mentioned, that what we need, and in fact, even Dr. Mathur as well, that what we need is really private sector taking a larger proportion of this and not the other way around. So in a nutshell, once again, adding the numbers just to make sure that we get the $100 right. So basically, only $10 worth of catalytic capital is really deployed by DFIs on their own account, and rest $35 is all at commercial value. Now, if you broadly see the two main value propositions which really DFIs bring on the table, which are very critical to the development agenda and also the discussion that we are having here today, right, on energy transition. One is the halo effect, which is very important. signaling credibility of deals to co-investors. This is a very important element, which brings a lot of confidence in transactions. And second, which is of course a very big plus which DFIs have, is the deal origination capabilities in emerging markets. This is a very specialized skill set, and it goes a long way to providing an active pipeline. But if you see, neither of these actually require a large positions in the deal. Okay, so this is where now we are getting into the discussion. Unfortunately, what we see is a very little pattern of DFIs blending to attract third-party capital. Right? What we are seeing is basically, sorry, coming back to the 2 points which I was mentioning, the value proposition, right? I think what's important is that DFI should always be asking this question, right? What is the minimum commitment it can make to deliver these two values, which is one, the halo effect, and the second is the deal origination capabilities, and what can it do to do so while minimizing the amount of protection it is receiving from concessional sources. And typically what we are seeing is that there are two broad situations. One is where the DFI has concessional money in-house from a donor and blends it in and inserts into the structure. And the second, where the DFIs do participate in other deals, right, as concessional investors. So if you see in the first instance, we see actually very little pattern of DFIs blending to attract third-party capital. In majority of the cases, the typical use is to really de-risk their own positions or to reduce their own cost of capital. And what would be really interesting to see is, DFIs taking really more risk on positions and use the concessional resources to actually de-risk the third parties, not themselves. In the second situation, the same applies. The DFIs should be really coming into more junior positions as a part of to the third party commercial capital. And so that's something which is very important. So now coming to actual suggestions and recommendations, and what opportunities do we have in front of us. So in summary, what we do believe is that instead of DFIs adhering to these current practices of weighing towards more hard currency senior loans, what is required is a more integrated approach where MDBs and DFIs could consider at least 50% of their capital really supporting financial assets with high additionality, which means you're looking at equity, local currency loans, mezzanine investments through blended finance vehicles. So that's one part. Once again, mezzanine positions can go a long way, because if they take the junior position, you can catalyze a lot of private sector money coming in. Also, what the third point is, what we've seen is that based on some indications from credit rating agencies, there is also potential for DFIs to further leverage their balance sheet without sacrificing two things, which they are very conscious about: capital adequacy ratios, which are normally mentioned or tightly governed by their shareholders, and second, their credit rating, which is of course very important to make sure that the cost of capital is lower for them, which helps them to do the development work. So currently, as we see, the current utilization rate on the balance sheet is somewhere around 35 to 40%. And there are estimates which quite clearly say that this could go as much as 75 to 80% without impacting the capital adequacy ratio requirements as well as the credit rating. So there is a lot that more could be done, right? The fourth point is really the role of DFI should be really to look at deal origination, but deal origination from a point of view of sharing. DFI should take the lead in providing a healthy pipeline actually to the market. The focus should be on recycling the capital so that there is a larger pool of capital. So rather than buying and holding, they should be looking at, once the project risks are more acceptable to the market, you can offload those assets and create a secondary private market for that in a way. And then also there could be, this could be done through other solutions like insurance, which Dr. Mathur spoke about, securitization, SPVs, etc. So those instruments are there, and we all know who have worked in, structured and capital markets, these instruments are there for us to deploy, and it's nothing new. And just last 2 points is one is around transactions versus structured facilities. What we've seen as a trend is that, and this is of course the way the KPIs of most of the DFIs are as well, right? People who are really doing the work there is focused on transactions, but not on structured facilities. And I think this is where, however, we do have to mention that we are seeing some encouraging trend there. There are some facilities now which we see which are going in that direction. You have the IFC Rockefeller Blended Finance Partnership, which came up on renewable energy, which basically is looking to put $150 million of catalytic capital to mobilize almost $2 billion in private sector financing. You have the ASEAN Catalytic Facility by ADB. So they are there, but they are not as many. And at least that's the right direction which the market is going towards. But if you see, at the heart of all of this is basically a change management agenda. So this is where somewhere the donor governments also need to think on what the KPI should be in terms of mobilization, so that we can really get the right scale that we need to achieve in achieving the SDGs, and more specifically climate transition in this particular case. And then one last point is around the opportunity that we have on hand for a local mobilization agenda. And this is more a call out to the local DFIs. We think there's tremendous opportunity there. This is not an area which has been explored in a big way. Of course, I'm not talking about the traditional structure where government provided subsidized financing and they've gone about doing it, but really truly blending different forms of concessional capital and then taking that to the next level. But what we are seeing is, in some cases, there is an alignment, but in most of the cases, I think this is work in progress where, it's aligning with the national government agenda, etc., etc. And one thing what we've also realized, and we do note that a capacity is a very big issue here. And there is a big challenge on understanding blended finance, and we are happy to play a role there. But let me stop there. I know I've gone slightly overboard of time, but I just wanted to also touch upon some interesting observations, but also solutions that could really change without changing anything big. This can all be done within the existing frameworks that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritesh. I think that was very useful in terms of putting out, deciphering really. How DFIs are looking at capital, what is the status and what needs to be done. And I fully agree that, leveraging the local DFIs, mobilizing capital there, I think that's a area which is not worked at enough, and that's the opportunity. So thanks for those comments, and stay on. I'll come back to you shortly. Let me go to Vibhuti. Vibhuti, we've seen that reforming multilateral development banks has been on the cards. It was a big agenda for the G20 under the India's presidency also. And now it is said that implementing the recommendations of the G20 expert group on capital adequacy frameworks could unlock an additional $80 billion of capital each year. So my question to you is, how can capital resources get unlocked from the proposed MDB reforms, which then can be looked at channelizing these particularly towards local DFIs to accelerate the funding. So I'm just taking a cue from what Ritesh has said and your views around these two areas. Thanks. Over to you, Vibhuti.
Thanks, Namita. I think before I talk about the MDB reforms, just for the context setting, the requirements as per the G20 leaders document, what's the need for this kind of a transition, especially by the developing countries to implement their NDCs, has been to the tune of 5.8 to 5.9 trillion US dollars pre-2030 level, which means we need about 4 trillion US dollars of investment in clean energy technologies. And that is just by the developing countries alone. And if we, one of the BNEF's latest report on India Energy Outlook, if I just kind of talk about what the requirements are, look for India, we need about 12.7 trillion US dollars to kind of reach our net zero emission goals. But again, and that means we need an average of 438 billion US dollars per year. So clearly there is a gap, and there is definitely a need to bring in more and more capital. We are seeing increasingly, there is an interest from private capital, but there are so many risks that the developing countries, which have been highlighted by the previous speakers, Dr. Mathur and others as well. The developing countries face additional risk of sovereign risk, foreign currency risks, payment risk, which makes the cost of capital higher for them. So what do we do in such a scenario? And that's where the role of MDBs and the DFIs becomes even more critical to unlock the capital from private players. So far, what we have been seeing is while they have been playing a role, and as Ritesh just rightly pointed out, most of it has been also, we are observing it is at a pilot scale, or the share of in the total of, if there is $100 required, so their share is very, very minimal. So how do we kind of make or increase that share? So for which we are seeing how, linking it with the MDB reforms, how they can channelize more and more investment to DFIs, which can further unlock more and more private capital, which is required. So, there's a lot being discussed already. So, or the reforms that have already started, the various initiatives that have already been undertaken, including the Bridgetown Initiative or the G20's review of MDB's capital adequacy framework. MDB themselves require more and more capital. So how do we kind of increase their capital adequacy, as well as the World Bank's evolution roadmap? So things are moving in the right direction, but how do we kind of, again, accelerate those reforms so that, we do have more private capital or more DFI and MDB capital playing that role of whether it is, concessional capital. I think the G20 leaders document again kind of said we want concessional capital, but we somehow undermine that role. But what we now see is shifting to blended finance. So we really want countries in emerging economies and developing economies not just to rely on concessional capital, but more on the blended finance. I think that's where the role shift has to now happen. And for that, what we need from, from these MDBs and the DFIs to reduce the cost of capital by providing more and more technical support to conduct, whether it's feasibility assessments, whether it's on due diligence, and also kind of vet projects based on local market intelligence. Further, they can play a role in providing, financing support for research and development as well. So it's not only once those established technologies are there, you start putting in money there. There is a lot of need for even the R&D especially for commercialization of low carbon technologies, which are still at the nascent state. I think that's where the role is much more bigger. Apart from financial institutions, there's a lot of capacity building and technical assistance even required from other stakeholders, in whether it's on industries to adopt, whether better disclosures, how to effectively use carbon price and earn revenue. So I think there are multiple roles that can be played, whether it's not only from the financial support, but also more from the technical assistance support if they can facilitate. So, and that's where domestic financial I would say development financial institutions can also kind of then aggregate these smaller investment into larger projects to bring out an investable, bankable pipeline for MDB capital as well. So I think that's where we see the role of more innovative financing mechanisms. A lot of it was discussed about the variation in the risk-adjusted profile, what they are expecting, the DFI's expectation of the returns versus how is being perceived by other developers. So how do we kind of ensure that the balance sheets are much more stretched? How do we ensure more capital adequacy, capital increases? All of this is being discussed, but I think we need to kind of ensure that all these reforms are now happening. So yeah, I'm going to stop here. Happy to answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Vibhuti. I think, there is, with the whole MDB reforms, if that comes, that requires a huge amount of effort, negotiation, mobilizing institutions, capacity, all of that. And I think if that goes through, then many of these issues that we are talking today could be addressed. So thanks. Thank you very much. Let me move on to Ahmad. Ahmad, we've seen how on the back of policies or regulations, markets have been created, right? And IRENA has been on the forefront of key policy making interventions. I'm sure there are much in the pipeline that you have right now when you look at facilitating financing for energy transition in particularly the emerging markets and developing economies. So I would like you to share, highlight some of these and talk about how regional DFIs could leverage these policies or interventions in order to contribute to the scale that we are talking about now. This is humongous amount of capital that's required. And what are your comments on it? Over to you, Ahmed.
Well, thank you, Namita, very much. I enjoyed listening to the interventions, but let me first say, basically, as we all know, IRENA is a policy-making institution globally mandated to work on energy transition, scaling up and speeding up. The idea here is that the team or the divisions that I am leading is basically came into life after 10 years of IRENA had been established. That's simply because the role of energy transition financing is becoming bigger and bigger, given the fact that there is no need anymore to convince any countries, even developing or developed, with the need of moving to energy transition, given now the current crisis globally, whether developing or developed countries is facing. The idea here is that the new service offering that IRENA is doing is to work with the countries scaling up their energy transition actions in the ground. And that's why a team of bankers led by me, we came to life into this. Why I'm saying that? Because actually, with all due respect to all discussion have been come in panel today, which I thank you very much to bring such high panel into discussion. But actually, the problem is not there. The problem is basically money is always there. And these days specifically, financing mobilized for energy transition is even tripled. So resources always there. The problem is not to find the money. In developing more than developed, there is always money there. I don't see there is any need to go for basically mobilizing more capital. We can speak a lot about financial arrangement and changing the balance sheet. All that's fine. But the problem is mainly for how to find a bankable project. Just to give you numbers, since we are talking about numbers, over past 4 years since I joined the IRENA, we've been asking, and we created 2 facilities, 2 platforms, and we'll discuss that maybe in the second intervention as exchanged with you. But the key point here is that for each 40 to 50 projects coming from developing and developed countries, only 1 project is bankable. The project that really meet the requirement of financing institution, not only DFIs. No. It's even public sector financing institution, even local financing institutions. And any banker who have fiduciary responsibility, accountability on his head has to secure that. We can talk whatever we want, but when it comes to money to lend, there is a lot of requirements, including all type of risks are there. And this has to be covered. By means or means has to be covered, including war risk, technology risk, financial risk, any risk. The key issue for me is to find a bankable project. Imagine Namita's number. Over the past decade, it's always between 30 to 40 projects. We can find hardly one. Now it's 40 to 50. This means that countries, developed and developing, are really having the need to support projects. But the idea is to find this bankable one to create it. And I'm not talking about small scale or large scale. No, I'm not talking about de-risking or not, or guarantee or not. I can tell you, I can count now from every day, there is 2 guarantee facility have been created. Every day at local, regional, international level. And I can give you by numbers, starting with developing. And local banks now, over past 5 years, I can tell you, yes, local financial institution needs to have a help to get de-risking guarantees facilities. That's okay. But now, with what EBRD and World Bank created now, a facility, just only a facility. When President Bajay came in, he pushed what we call it World Bank Global Infrastructure Facility. What is this function of this facility? It's mainly to work on finding bankable projects. IFC, if they look, or EBRD, I'm an ex-EBRD senior executive there, and it's the same for IFC. The idea here is that to find a project that IFC is able to finance, they have to go through 40 to 50 projects to find hardly one, whatever is the scale. Maybe IFC is going for larger scale, but if you go for EBRD, they have a smaller scale. I'm just giving an example. If you go for basically bilateral financial institution, as DFIs also, okay, they have this. That's why this hard number to find. That's why in IRENA, we started to work on creating such kind of platforms to help the countries to create bankable projects, a project that financing institution will be able to find. As for leveraging, because we were discussing about leveraging, I can tell you the leverage from private sector, when we find a bankable project, is always 1 to 10 to 12. Private sector are very interested at all scale to come and finance. This is the experience I can tell. Over past 3 or 4 years, including COVID time, I can tell you private sector, mainly in Southeast Asia and in Asia countries in general, they are very active when they find a project at local financing institution, regional financing institution, starting with AIIB, ADB, New Development Bank, as well as local financing institution. They are always there. But the point for them is get them bankable projects. The point is that we can discuss that later. I don't want to take more of the time, but the issue of regulatory arrangement, not by the regulators, by the governments, and also by financing institutions to accept this risk, this is another issue we have to take care of. That's exactly another important area I think we discuss. I will stop here. I believe we still have another round of discussion. We can give more details. Over to you. Thank you, Lemit.
Thank you, Ahmed. This is a very relevant point, and it also reminds me of an initiative on closing the investment gap that Irving had put together since I think 2016 or 2017, where we had 5 Asian countries bringing in. I think how do you create bankable projects? I think that was the requirement. And I think there also technical assistance need to expand a little in terms of, creating bankable projects, because there is a hand-holding that is required. So I agree that there is enough capital and the project pipeline sometimes is weak and therefore capital doesn't flow through. But thanks. And we have exactly about half an hour to go. So I would go into the second round, but I would request each of the panelists to limit your interventions to about 2 minutes, because there are very interesting questions in the chat box that I want to take. So let me quickly go to Anand. Anand, how can banks in emerging markets adapt their legacy risk management processes to better identify risks and mitigation measures, particularly in emerging segments, like renewable energy solutions? So essentially, what is required to ensure that risks are well understood and priced in properly? So, this also correlates to the bankability of projects that we're talking about. Anand?
Sure, thanks. So as a banker, I have seen for the last 20 years, credit risk is fundamentally a simple thing. Why should I believe your story, and why should I believe you can repay me back? So I don't believe that what we call as legacy risk management tools or legacy risk architecture needs to change. what banks can do better on risk management is around looking at different data. For example, if I'm looking at, let's say, rooftop financing. In rooftop financing, I can look at maybe alternate source of information about the borrower because this would be typically MSME. So when you're looking at digitalized space, when you're doing individuals or you're doing, MSMEs, one way out by which banks can review how they look at proposals is by looking at alternate data sources. And I think that's the area that I would want to focus on. By itself, risk management is not likely to change materially. But by having different data sources come in, you can build a toolkit which allows you to assess models, assess proposals in a more lenient manner without sacrificing core credit viability. Another example is, let's look at again MSC cluster financing. Suppose there's a cluster of MSMEs who want to put up rooftop solars or want to put up a captive solar plant or a captive renewable plant, which is entirely only for group usage. We could get some linkage to an OEM and say that, how are the cash flows of these people going to improve? Will costs come down? Can the OEM trap it on our behalf? So as banks, we can look at innovative structures around the margin or innovative data sources to assess the borrower. But the core of risk management is unlikely to change. And that's for a good reason, as I said. It's a good reason it shouldn't change beyond a point of view. Back to you.
Yeah, no, that's very agreeable. And thanks for that. I will go to Hussain. Hussain, we've seen that large DFIs often engage with intermediated lending institutions, local institutions, who then in turn lend to small and medium-sized firms, right? So the challenge is that as local banks, they may not have necessarily alignment to the Paris Agreement or the larger agenda, the NDCs, so on and so forth, or even, a target to lend to energy transition. So in order to catalyze private capital, what can MDBs do, the large ones, to enhance the role of local DFIs? Especially keeping in mind the volume of capital that's going to be required going forward. Over to you, Hussain.
Thank you, Ramita. I think interesting from the previous conversation, I think there's a lot of sharing especially from Ritesh, PPT, and also Ahmad, that this is covered from what MDBs can do for the DFIs. A lot of DFIs have these issues that they don't have skill sets that is strong enough to come up with a methodology, or how do they do the assessment. And Ahmad mentioned about the bankable financing. So in the case of BPMB, a lot of our projects are very long term. So for us to know whether that's bankable or not, we need to see it through. So if it is 25 years, then there will be 5 series of change of management or the board, and then you can see whether that's really a bankable solution or not. Then we come back to the question of how do you assess in the first place? So this is interesting to see how we work with World Bank initially back in 2019 when we have this MIND framework. So that is the initial start where none of the DFI in Malaysia have this. So we want to have something that we can evaluate other than cash flows. So we have this methodology, then we can understand why we are in that project. Then we can look at additionality. And this is where the technical assistance from MDB will be very, very useful for DFI. And the keyword from that is really about continuation of the program. We engage again with World Bank to come and look at how we have done with the MIND framework in somewhere middle last year. And they come up with recommendation, how you can improve it, how you use it, so that it can be used as intended purpose. So the first item is very much on the technical skills. Second one, in terms of capacity building, I agree totally with Vibhuti that this is where DFI also struggle with having capacity building, because usually the goods one will go to the commercial banks. So this is also, we need a kind of assistance and collaboration with MDB so that we can have a good experts in the DFI. And I totally agree with Ritesh that a lot of ambiguity in terms of what is blended financing. So for DFI to come into that space, we need to understand what it's all about. And we need to understand how it is structured. I think Ritesh mentioned a lot about the numbers, then I try to follow, but eventually I know that's become 100 eventually. So that is interesting. I really appreciate this conversation, but that's where the MDB can really play the role to help the DFI, because of course, I agree also, capital is not really something that the DFI is struggling with, but to find bankable projects and to do the assessment properly, that's actually the real issue. Back to you, Namita.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, my screen is behaving a little funnily, so I missed going to Sebastian. Sebastian is the user of the capital. So Sebastian, I want to ask you a question. I want you to share your experiences on some of the typical challenges that you have seen when offering products and services that enable the whole energy transition, especially when it comes to grassroots level communities. So if you could highlight what are your asks from DFIs and commercial financiers that they need to be mindful of. Over to you, Sebastian. And sorry for missing you out in the first round.
No worries, Namita. Let me just, I can't resist, but when we talk about financial sectors, we always talk about the transformation of the sector. I don't know why only in the energy sector we talk about a transition. I think that train has left the station somewhere in the 70s, 80s, 70s when Avery Lovins was talking about a soft pass. I think there's no more soft pass. And I think we should really call it a transformation, because it's as defined as a transformation, it's a large scale whole society change. I just wanted to drop that in. Now, Namita, on your question on the clean energy deficit, I mean, again, also to underline, it's not only a clean energy deficit, right? Like I'm speaking from Bangladesh here now, it's a energy deficit we're dealing with, right? So it's great if it is clean, but first we need to meet the deficit. And globally, we know, I mean, the numbers are known, there's still 700-800 million people without access to electricity, and you have probably another billion with an extremely intermittent supply. What we learned on the ground and where I see the gap to the DFI is, first of all, a ground reality is poor people don't need cheap products. They need high quality products made affordable, which means it's a financing issue. And let me give you an example. Bangladesh has 4 million electric vehicles. That's a little more than Tesla has sold in the whole world so far. These EVs are three-wheeler taxis. It's a fantastic opportunity. It's basically the transportation backbone of the country. But all of these 4 million vehicles use lead-acid batteries. Not only are they a very ill-suited solution as a battery for that vehicle, because they actually are not supposed to be in a mobility use case, so they break after 8 months. But why are they used? Because it's the cheapest. It's fast. You know, you buy it, the 8 months breaks it, you buy a new one. If I was to use a lithium battery, which is in every Tesla, it would last probably 7-8 times longer and cost 2-3 times more. So everybody in the room can make the math. This is a financing issue, and not a small one. 4 million vehicles is 4 million batteries. Each battery, let's say $1,500. That's $6 billion as a financing market. Now, Dr. Mathur said the perceived risk in Africa is 5%. Let's assume for a moment it would be the same for Bangladesh. Then 6%, you actually said, 6%. Then through the Ukraine war, we have all these ripple effects on Forex reserves going down. So we have a huge FX risk. If I take a loan in dollars, get repaid in taka, it's a disaster, right? It's another 5%. So only premium plus FX risk is already 11%. And we haven't even started the negotiation on the normal loan interest rate. So I think these are challenges where in these new situations, DFIs think, and I mean, Namita, you referred to the DFI reform mechanism beyond traditional project. I think this is something we should work on. And the last point here where I see the gap to the DFI is, it was really clearly outmarked by Dr. Mathur, is there's a concentration on big solar. Why is that? Because if I finance 100 megawatt, 200 megawatt solar plant, I have to monitor one plant. But if I finance 100 rooftops, I have to monitor 100 plants. If I finance 1 million batteries, I would need to monitor 1 million vehicles, and possibly the ownership would also be segregated. So I think we need to acknowledge that there are new tools to monitor. So in our case, we put an IoT device in every battery. So I can monitor all batteries remotely. And if someone doesn't pay, I can switch it off. So I have a payment enforcement mechanism, and I also have a revenue collection mechanism because everything can be paid via mobile money. I'm not sure whether any of these tools are considered in the risk assessment of these financial organizations. And I think that is a big task and quest. I mean, we are trying to find out because we're saying we're bringing the credit risk down because we switch the battery off if someone doesn't pay. That's a big difference. You also don't need to go there and collect the money. It's automatically paid. And if you don't pay, you can't use your vehicle. If you can't use your vehicle, that's a taxi, you lose more money than you would need to pay. So they're very strong incentives. Now I'll pause here. Thanks, Namita.
This is a very important point, leveraging technology or leveraging, these kind of elements to secure the credit profile. I think that's a very important point made. So very quickly, let me go to Ritesh. And Ritesh, if I could request you to limit your intervention for about 2 minutes. So, you spoke about the financial risk. And let me ask you, what kind of mitigation structures do you think are most practical for financiers to consider to facilitate this transition? And, when we're talking about large populations, typically what Sebastian has just mentioned, right? So over to you very quickly, Ritesh. Thank you.
Thanks, Namita, for that, for asking that question. And we do get asked this question a lot in most of the forums. To respond to this question on a more lighter note, it's like asking whether debt or equity is best for developing an economy, right? So the whole point, what we always try to say is, the question that we should be asking is, what's the project? What are we cooking? The best instrument is the one that answers the challenge presented in a specific situation. So if the situation or the problem is the cost of capital, then we have to do things that reduce a cost of capital, like say a concessional capital in the investment structure. If the problem is lack of pipeline, maybe the best answer is to push some cheap money at early stage ideas forward, or maybe, come up with a technical assistance facility which throws more interesting pipeline into the market. Or if the problem is really there are a lot of commercial banks around, but they don't want to take the risk, the answer could potentially be in form of guarantee and so forth. So basically the key message, and I'm really going to stop my intervention here and I'll keep it under 1 minute, is don't use the instrument to assess the problem. Rather start with the problem and then supply or apply the appropriate instrument that you need from a structuring point of view, which will really help you to get the right structure or the optimal capital structure, which will really advance the goals. So that's my response.
There are no one-size-fits-all solutions.
Unfortunately not,
very customized. I agree. Thank you. And Vibhuti, carbon markets development, carbon pricing, I think these are sensitive issues currently. And, how do you really, in your view, how do you see this whole space growing? And what is the role that financiers can play to facilitate this space? Over to you, Vibhuti.
I think you're very right. How do we price carbon in countries who are on very different parts of development, who historically have not contributed to the carbon sink, but now with increasing demand are becoming big polluters. So clearly there is a big challenge. However, we need to strike a balance between, pricing carbon, but ensuring industries are not negatively impacted. And this also would mean providing more policy and fiscal support in adoption of low carbon technology so that switch becomes easy. So when we are looking at carbon pricing, I think we really need to look at how effectively we are using the different mechanisms, whether it's a carbon tax or whether it's a cap and trade, emission trading systems primarily. So as far as the carbon tax is concerned, it just increases your costs upfront. And especially industries which have very thin profit margins struggles more. And also there is more issue of more leakage happening because companies will start shifting their production base to areas where there is no such regulation also. So there are risks attached, but in terms of, say, if we talk about the cap and trade or the ETS mechanism, I think how do we define what are the emission targets going to be for different industries? So that becomes very, very important. How do we then monitor and then evaluate the reduction for the scheme to be effective? But the way the DFIs or the MDBs can help is to channelize more and more investment into these technologies and sectors who have these targets being laid out. So compared to the proven energy transition technologies, where they can play a much more effective role is on the transitionary assets. And they would need, more support in coming up with science-based definition or taxonomy of such assets, as well as how do we help these companies also kind of, come out with their detailed transition plan? As I said earlier, we need really strong and robust monitoring, reporting, and evaluation practices. So technical grants rooted through DFIs to help develop these requirements can really play a big role. And also referring to Mr. Hussein's point on, these funding also needs to factor in the issue of just transitions as well. So that's when you'll have more acceptability as well when such carbon pricing comes into. So including the social element as well is very, very crucial when you are defining, what kind of pricing do we see.
Thanks. I think, that leads me to the question to Ahmed, and you mentioned about just transition. So IRENA has a just and inclusive energy transition framework. And Ahmed, you did mention about the role of regulators. Particularly, what are your views on how can they leverage these kind of, frameworks to be able to make the right kind of policies or frameworks that need to be brought out? So over to you, Ahmed. Ahmed, you're muted. You're on mute.
Sorry, I was focusing on your question, so sorry for that. What I'm saying is that basically here in IRENA, we are supporting the issue of how we empower regulators from similar perspectives or several fronts. One of them is basically by providing a comprehensive analysis of the country and what are the areas that need to be done. And here is basically talking about at macroeconomic level. This is basically represented by what we're calling it as one of the IRENA tools as analytical tool, RRA, standing for Renewable Readiness Assessment. And by that, we basically prepare the country what needs to be done at macro level in terms of regulations and institutional reform in order to attract more investment in specific and private sector at macroeconomic level in terms of regulations and rules and such kind of articulation of reform. But more importantly now at project level, basically we created two kind of platform. One of them is called ITAF, which we partnered with about 10 MDBs. Some of them are regional, some of them are global, like World Bank, like EBRD, but also Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and mobilized more than $2 billion, which we work on project-based intervention, by which when we find any kind of regulatory reform need to be done at energy transition level, not only power sector, but also transportation, agriculture, health, but through project-based intervention. Here, basically, we are focusing more on bankable projects and more preferably on demand-driven, and I would like to stress again, on demand-driven, larger-scale projects. And we created and mobilized, or to give examples, mobilized more than 1,000 megawatt, most of which are in Asia. Since we established this platform, it's called Energy Transition Accelerator Financing Platform for ITAF. And because of success on that tool specifically, UNFCCC and COP28 presidency are putting them as one of the role model on how can we scale up that at NDPs globally within the effort globally that we are doing with UN for NDP reform. The final tool here is specifically was created also with UNDP under initiative of UN Secretary General back in 2019, as well as EC for All, and in close collaboration with the Green Climate Fund. We call it Climate Investment Platform, which is an open platform to help any private sector from developing and develop at all scale. And we're talking here very sector-wide, so we are partnering with more than 80 banks globally, some of which are local, some of which are regional, some of them are global one. And we, until this moment, we didn't have such kind of achievement of more than 1,000 megawatt of clean renewable energy that we financially closed under DAF, the other platform. But with this one platform, CIP, we financially closed more than 80 megawatt, again, most of which are in Asia, given that the most booming economy in terms of developing and developed countries coming from Asia. I think I don't want to elaborate more, but we can discuss offline with any interested partners to get more detail into this. Over to you. Thank you, Nimi.
Thank you, Ahmed. And I'm also keeping an eye on the questions that are coming to me. And Sebastian, there's a question here which was very interesting, a fallout of what you just mentioned. So data-related challenges, they are the big elephant in the room, right? So in order to enhance bankability of projects, what are you doing, or what project developers and financiers need to do coming together? So that's an audience question, but I also had a similar question. So Sebastian, over to you.
Thank you, Namita. I think I touched upon it already a little bit, is that I just said it, we finance big projects, right? Because it's easier to monitor. So how do we use technology to bring down this monitoring cost, which is perceived as better to have one big project than 100 or 1,000 smaller ones? And that is usually through IoT. So how do we link this to the risk reduction potential of a DFI? And Ahmed said there are no bankable projects. And my answer would be, okay, first of all, how do we define bankable? Because if we say bankable is the maximization of financial plus social return, okay, how do we measure social return, right? He shakes his head, so it's only financial, I suppose. That's number one. And the second one, is it a level playing field? If I build a solar plant here, I have to pay for the evacuation. And if it's 20 kilometers, I have to buy the land, the 2 centimeter stripe, to put my line there. If I build a coal power plant, I don't need to do that. So yes, bankability, right? Is it a level playing field? So that would be just my 2 comments on the bankability issue. And if we are to imply data and IoT as an example, if you are able to remotely access 1 million batteries, then that's exactly what Dr. Mathur said. That is the key requirement for further renewables, to have storage. Now, if I command 1 million batteries remotely, I can, for instance, here in Bangladesh, I have a buffering potential of 20-25% of the entire electricity load. So I need to factor that also in. That's not something which I can factor in monetarily today, because the policy requirements for this, for grid ancillary service, are not even in place here yet. So I think there is still some gaps to bridge here.
Thank you very much. I think that's useful. I was just looking at the questions, and there is one provocative question here that I see in the chat box, and that is about, carbon tax. Is it found to be prohibitory? Wouldn't companies not choose to just pay the tax and continue to emit? So anybody would like to answer that? Any of the panelists? So that's one of the questions that's here on carbon tax. And the second one is on how can banks integrate climate risks, which is a forward-looking with other conventional risk buckets, which are more based on historical data. So how can stress tests integrating these 2 sets of risks really work? So maybe Vibhuti, you could take the carbon tax question, and maybe Ritesh, I'll pull you in to answer on the climate risk part.
I think I just want to cite here the example of CBAM, which is we become effective from October 1st, where for the initial 2 years, we don't, the companies will not be penalized, but starting 2026, the companies will be penalized. So it's not like, if you have imposed carbon tax on companies which are not complying with those norms. So there is a big risk that you are going to lose your business, or they could be, as I said, some of the leakages that we were talking about, the companies will shift their production to countries where there are very relaxed norms. So there are all kind of risks that comes with having a carbon tax. And if there is a possibility to shift out, they will happen, or else you will lose business. Because now there are big mandates. When we talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. So clearly we are seeing the trend, not only you want to control the scope 2 emissions, but the companies are setting target for scope 2 and scope 3 emissions as well. So it's best for the industries to start getting ready now for, even if you are just providing an input and you are not directly under scope 1 emissions, but we are running out of time. And I think we need to act now rather than wait for more and more strict regulations to kick in the coming years.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ritesh, you want to respond to that very quickly on the climate risks versus conventional risks?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on risk, but all I can just very briefly mention that, I'm sure colleagues here have heard about NGFS, the network for greening the financial systems, and most of the regulators are a part of this network, and they are clearly integrating climate risk in their modeling and everything as well. And then they're also kind of putting it to banks also to kind of look at it. It's not happening in all countries, but I know for sure that this is something which is an ongoing work, especially the regulators who are associated with the network. You see a more evolved framework on climate risk, which of course also gets passed on to the private sector and the financial institutions. But apologies, I'm really not an expert, so I don't want to comment more than this. Yeah.
Great. I think we are also on dot. So time to close. Very, very interesting conversation. Diverse channels of development, capital, systemic approach that considers socioeconomic, financial risk systems simultaneously and with customized solutions. I think that is what we really are looking forward to. And these customized solutions need to also be scalable. I think that is what came out, very clearly. There are unprecedented market opportunities. It is about bankability, and we need a lot of work and capital capacity building towards that. So that's my learning from this session. Thank you very much. And over to you, Smita, for the closing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Namita. Yeah, truly very insightful. And thank you to everybody for your enthusiastic participation. So we've come to the end of this webinar, and thank you very much to all the speakers and panelists for their valuable inputs. I hope you enjoyed the session as much as we enjoyed hosting it. The conversations have been really riveting and having provided us with a lot of food for thought. So thank you again, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you. Bye.